10:17 p.m. The door to the room closed quietly, and in this hypothetical story, Yul Edochie could do nothing but stand frozen in the corridor after hearing the words no son ever once associated with his father. Terminal cancer. For several seconds, no one spoke. At 79, Pete Edochie, the man whose commanding voice, fearless presence, and unforgettable performances had made him appear almost indestructible to generations of viewers, was suddenly at the center of a very different battle. This cancer storyline is entirely hypothetical and created for storytelling purposes. It should not be understood as a confirmed medical diagnosis of Pete Edochie. But within this imagined night, age had already begun leaving quiet marks on him. His steps were slower, exhaustion came more easily, and the strength that once seemed permanent was being challenged by an aging body. Now, the possibility of terminal cancer turned those small changes into something terrifying for the family. Yul remained outside the room, staring at the closed door as though opening it might force him to accept a reality he was not ready to face. According to the imagined account, another family member sat nearby holding a phone tightly, but never made a call. On an empty chair beside them stood a glass of water that nobody had touched. Minutes passed, yet the water remained perfectly still. Inside the room, Pete was said to be enduring waves of pain and overwhelming fatigue, while outside his family struggled with another kind of suffering. The helplessness of watching someone they had always depended upon become vulnerable. For Yul, the contrast was almost unbearable. He remembered the father who could enter a room and immediately command attention, the man whose deep voice seemed capable of silencing everyone around him. But at 10:17 that night, none of that could protect a 79-year-old body from age, pain, or the frightening limits of human strength. Yul reportedly lowered his head and pressed his hands together, trying not to let the emotions overwhelm him. No dramatic cry came from the corridor. There was only silence, and somehow that silence hurt more. What happens to a family when the man they once believed feared nothing is suddenly forced to confront his own mortality? And what can a son possibly say when he realizes that love cannot remove his father's pain? Yul looked toward the door once more. Someone finally picked up the untouched glass of water, hesitated, and quietly placed it back on the chair. The corridor grew darker as the night deepened, while behind the closed door, a faint light remained on beside Pete's bed, and Yul was still standing there, waiting. Weeks before that haunting night at 10:17 p.m., there had been no dramatic announcement, no hospital corridor, and no terrifying diagnosis hanging over the family. In this entirely hypothetical storyline, there were only small changes, so ordinary that everyone found reasons not to fear them. Pete Edochie was 79, and whenever he seemed more tired than usual, the easiest explanation was age. His footsteps had become slower. Sometimes, halfway through a family conversation, he would quietly lower himself into a chair and remain there longer than before. "I'm fine," he would supposedly insist whenever someone looked at him with concern. And because it was Pete, the strong father, the commanding figure everyone was accustomed to seeing, his family wanted desperately to believe him. This imagined sequence is not evidence of cancer or any confirmed illness. These details are fictional storytelling elements meant to portray the vulnerability that can accompany old age. Yet Yul gradually began noticing things that were difficult to forget. His father sometimes became unusually quiet while everyone else continued talking. At dinner, food occasionally remained untouched on his plate. The chair Pete had always used casually now seemed occupied far more often. None of these moments proved anything, and individually they appeared almost meaningless. Together, however, they created an uneasiness Yul could not easily explain. One afternoon in this fictional timeline, Pete stood up as if he intended to walk into another room, took several steps, then stopped. His hand rested briefly against the back of the chair. Yul noticed. Pete noticed that Yul had noticed. For a second, their eyes met. Then Pete straightened himself and continued walking as though nothing had happened. No one asked a question. That silence became the family's strange form of protection. Perhaps they were not ignoring him because they did not care. Perhaps they cared so deeply that admitting he was becoming weaker felt almost like betrayal. To acknowledge his aging body was to acknowledge something even more frightening, that the father who had always seemed permanent was not permanent at all. Pete continued asking about the children, discussing ordinary family matters, and wearing the familiar expression of a man determined not to become the center of everyone's concern. Yul played along, but his eyes increasingly followed his father across the room. Then came another dinner. Conversations moved around the table, someone laughed, and Pete smiled briefly. But when everyone eventually stood up, his plate remained almost full. Yul looked at it, then toward his father slowly walking away. He said nothing. Moments later, the room was empty, except for that familiar chair pulled slightly away from the table and a plate of food growing cold beside it. By the time the family finally decided that Pete's growing exhaustion could no longer be explained away so easily, the atmosphere had already begun to change. In this hypothetical storyline, what started as slower footsteps, unfinished meals, and longer moments in his chair eventually led to a medical examination. Nothing about that morning felt dramatic at first. There was only a long corridor, cold white lights overhead, and the steady sound of footsteps disappearing behind closed doors. Yul walked beside his 79-year-old father, but spoke very little. Every few minutes, he looked at the clock. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Somehow, each movement of the second hand seemed louder than the conversations around them. Pete tried to maintain the same composure his family had known for years, but the tiredness on his face was becoming harder to hide. This remains a fictional cancer storyline created solely for dramatic storytelling and is not a confirmed account of Pete Edochie's health. In the waiting area, one member of the family reportedly asked a simple question. What if this was more than old age? Nobody answered. Yul stared toward the end of the corridor. Another relative looked down at a phone without reading anything on the screen. The question remained suspended between them because saying the possibility aloud would make it feel frighteningly real. Then the rhythm of the imagined story changed. The waiting became heavier. The doors opened and closed. People walked past, but Yul barely noticed them. In the darkest hypothetical turn of this story, the family was confronted with exactly what they had been desperately trying not to imagine. The examination suggested a cancerous illness at a serious advanced stage. There was no need for screaming. No dramatic words could make that moment heavier than the silence that followed. Yul did not cry immediately. He simply sat down. His elbows rested on his knees, his hands locked together, and for several seconds he stared at the floor. The father he had watched command screens and rooms with seemingly endless strength was now being forced, within this fictional scenario, into a battle that strength alone could not control. Around Yul, nobody seemed to know where to look. The earlier denial suddenly felt painfully fragile. Those unfinished meals returned to his memory. The hand resting against the chair, the slower walk, the long silences. None of those moments had proven cancer, but now, in this imagined nightmare, they became memories the family could no longer stop replaying. Pete remained quiet. Yul finally lifted his head and looked toward his father, but no words came. At the far end of the corridor, a door slowly closed, leaving only the white hospital light reflected across the polished floor and the shadow of a sun sitting motionless beneath it. For Yul Edochie, the hardest part of this imagined ordeal was no longer the hospital, the waiting, or even the frightening possibility the family had just been forced to confront. It was looking at his father and not knowing what to say. This remains a hypothetical cancer storyline created for storytelling purposes, not a confirmed account of Pete Edochie's health. Yet within this reconstruction, something deeply human begins to happen to Yul. He is an adult, a father himself, a man accustomed to making his own decisions. But the moment he sees 79-year-old Pete sitting quietly before him, exhausted and vulnerable, all those years seem to disappear. For a few seconds, Yul is simply a son again. He wants to ask, "Are you in pain?" But the question remains trapped inside him because he is terrified of hearing the answer. He wants to promise that everything will be all right, yet he knows that promises can become cruel when nobody knows what tomorrow will bring. So he does what many frightened children do in front of their parents. He pretends to be stronger than he feels. In this imagined scene, Yul enters the room with controlled steps, adjusts something near his father's chair, asks an ordinary question, then forces a small smile. Pete looks back at him with the familiar steadiness of a father who does not want his child to worry. But when Yul walks into the corridor, his expression changes. He stops for several seconds before continuing. His shoulders fall. He draws a slow breath, gathers himself, and only then turns back toward the door. Memories begin arriving without permission, not invented dramatic conversations, but fragments of a lifetime. Growing up under the presence of a famous father, seeing Pete's unmistakable authority, hearing the voice generations of audiences would recognize instantly. In this fictional reconstruction, those memories now collide with the sight of an aging man whose body can no longer obey him as easily as before. And that is where the cruelest contradiction emerges. Pete tries to appear strong because he does not want Yul to be afraid. Yul tries to appear strong because he does not want Pete to worry. Father and son are therefore doing exactly the same thing, hiding fear to protect each other. Neither realizes that the other can already see through the disguise. Later, Yul returns and sits nearby. No great speech follows. Pete remains quiet. Yul looks toward him, almost asks the question he has been carrying all day, then stops. Between them sits a silence filled with everything neither man is prepared to say. Outside, footsteps continue along the corridor. Inside, Pete slowly closes his eyes to rest, while Yul stays in his chair watching his father's breathing, counting each rise and fall of his chest without realizing he has begun to count. The days that followed no longer seemed to belong to a normal calendar. In this hypothetical storyline, the family stopped measuring time by appointments, meals, or ordinary plans. They began measuring it by how Pete Edochie felt when he opened his eyes each morning. This cancer narrative remains entirely fictional and is used only for storytelling. It should not be interpreted as a confirmed diagnosis or medical account of Pete's real health. Within this imagined period, however, 79 years of age suddenly carried a different weight. Some mornings Pete appeared alert, speaking with his family for long stretches and showing flashes of the commanding personality they knew so well. On other days, fatigue arrived earlier, and he preferred silence and rest. Yul learned to notice the smallest changes. Was his father's voice weaker than yesterday? Had he eaten enough? Was he resting because he wanted to, or because his body demanded it? His phone was always within reach. Even when nothing happened, Yul checked it repeatedly, as though one missed call could change everything. The entire family gradually changed the language they used around Pete. At first, the unspoken question had been, "When will everything return to normal?" But that question slowly disappeared. In its place came something simpler. "How are you feeling today?" That shift carried a painful realization. Sometimes there is no immediate return to yesterday. Sometimes a family must learn to live inside today. Yet Pete was not portrayed as helpless in this imagined struggle. Age and illness might have changed what his body could tolerate, but they did not erase his dignity or his place as a father. When he wanted quiet, the family respected it. When he wanted conversation, they stayed. When he wanted to make a decision for himself, Yul resisted the instinct to decide everything on his behalf. That may have been one of the hardest lessons for a frightened son. Caring for an aging parent does not mean taking away his voice. Still, Yul could see how difficult dependence sometimes felt for a man accustomed to controlling his own schedule and moving through life on his own terms. Pete occasionally needed more time to stand, more time to walk, more time simply to recover his energy. Yul would move closer instinctively, then stop just short of reaching for him unless his father wanted help. It became a quiet dance between protection and respect. One evening, Pete was awake longer than expected. The family gathered around him, and for a brief period the room almost felt ordinary again. Someone spoke. Pete responded. A faint smile appeared. Yul smiled too. Then Pete leaned back and closed his eyes, signaling that he had had enough for the day. Everyone slowly left except Yul. He placed the phone beside his father, adjusted the chair slightly, and stepped toward the doorway. Before leaving, he turned around. Pete was resting peacefully, one hand still lying beside the phone, while Yul remained beneath the doorway light, unsure whether to walk away or stay for one more minute. That night, nobody said they were afraid, yet nobody wanted to leave the room. In this entirely fictional storyline, Pete Edochie's condition seemed more fragile than it had on the previous days, enough to make every small movement draw the family's attention. This sequence is a dramatic reconstruction only. It does not represent a confirmed medical event or diagnosis involving Pete Edochie. There were no screaming sirens, no frantic declarations, and no suggestion that he was about to die. The fear came from something quieter. Yul had been sitting beside his 79-year-old father for what felt like hours when he finally stood and walked toward the doorway. He had taken only a few steps when a faint voice behind him made him stop. Pete had called him softly. Yul turned immediately. For a moment he simply stared at his father, then walked back and pulled the chair closer to the bed. One by one, other family members gathered inside. Someone tried to begin an ordinary conversation, perhaps hoping normal words could make the night feel normal too, but every sentence seemed to lose its way. Questions about tomorrow suddenly sounded too heavy. Memories of yesterday felt strangely dangerous. So they remained together, speaking occasionally and allowing long stretches of silence to fill the room. Yul stayed closer to Pete than usual. He watched his father's face, then looked away whenever Pete opened his eyes, almost as if he feared being caught worrying. Pete, meanwhile, retained the quiet dignity of a father who did not want the entire room revolving around his weakness. In this imagined moment, he still indicated when he wanted silence, when he wanted to rest, and when he wanted his family nearby. Then Yul noticed his father's hand resting on the edge of the blanket. It was an aging hand, marked by time, lying completely still. Yul's own hand rested only a few centimeters away. He could have reached across instantly, yet for several seconds he did not. That tiny distance seemed to contain everything he had refused to confront. The passing years, the changing roles between parent and child, and the terrifying possibility that one day a familiar hand would no longer be there to reach for. Finally, Yul moved his fingers forward and gently covered his father's hand. No speech followed. Nothing needed to be explained. Pete remained quiet, and Yul did not move away. Around them, the family slowly stopped trying to fill the silence. Minutes passed. Someone lowered the lights. Another person placed a chair beside the wall and sat down instead of going home. Yul kept his hand where it was. Outside the room, the corridor became quieter as the night deepened. Inside, several chairs remained occupied, and beneath the dim bedside light, the hands of father and son stayed together on the edge of the blanket. After that long night, nothing dramatic happened the next morning. There was no sudden emergency, no new revelation, and no moment that demanded everyone rush through another hospital corridor. Instead, in this hypothetical storyline, something quieter changed inside Yul Edochie. He began to understand that what frightened him most was not simply the imagined illness itself. It was time. For most of his life, time with his father had felt almost automatic. There would always be another conversation, another family gathering, another opportunity to sit together. But now, at 79, Pete's presence no longer felt like something Yul could take for granted. It is important to repeat that the cancer events described in this story are fictional and should not be interpreted as a confirmed diagnosis or medical account concerning Pete Edochie. Within this imagined reconstruction, however, the family's rhythm became slower. Conversations no longer needed to reach anywhere. Sometimes Pete spoke for several minutes and everyone listened. Sometimes he said almost nothing, and nobody tried to force words into the silence. Yul discovered that sitting beside his father could matter more than finding the perfect sentence. One afternoon, Pete sat near a window looking outside. The light moved slowly across the room while Yul remained a short distance behind him. Other family members walked quietly through the house, lowering their voices without being asked. For once, nobody seemed interested in the clock. Yul watched his father looking through the glass and thought about how strange time could be. As children, we often believe our parents exist outside it. Their faces change gradually, their movements become slower, but because we see them year after year, we rarely notice exactly when strength begins giving way to age. Then one day, a small gesture makes everything visible. A slower step, a longer rest, a hand reaching for the chair before standing. In this fictional story, Yul no longer tried to pretend those moments meant nothing. But neither did he allow fear to reduce Pete to an illness. Pete was still his father, still capable of choosing when to speak, when to rest, and how he wanted the people around him to behave. The imagined battle therefore became less about defeating something and more about protecting the dignity of ordinary time. Yul began staying a little longer after conversations ended. He stopped checking his phone so often. If Pete looked outside, Yul sometimes simply sat nearby and looked in the same direction. There were no speeches about mortality between them, no dramatic promises. Just a father and a son sharing minutes that suddenly seemed more valuable because neither could assume they were endless. Late that afternoon, Pete remained beside the window. Yul sat behind him without speaking. The sunlight gradually disappeared from the floor, family footsteps faded into another room, and for several quiet seconds, the only movement was the curtain rising and falling gently beside his father's chair. 10:17 p.m. We are back at exactly the same moment where this story began, but the corridor no longer feels as frighteningly loud as it did before. The footsteps have faded. The conversations have stopped. Behind the half-closed door, Pete Edochie is resting in this imagined storyline, while Yul sits only a short distance away. His phone is still beside him, but he is no longer checking it every few seconds. There is nothing on that screen more important than the man in front of him. And before this story moves another second forward, one thing must be made absolutely clear. The storyline presented here about Pete Edochie suffering from terminal cancer at the age of 79 is a fictional storytelling scenario, not a confirmed medical diagnosis or verified report about his health. The imagined illness was never meant to be the truth that remains after the story ends. What remains is something far simpler and perhaps far more difficult to accept. The moment an adult son realizes that his father is growing older and that time with the people we love can never be assumed to be infinite. Yul looks toward Pete. There is no dramatic conversation between them, no prediction about tomorrow, no promise that everything will return to the way it once was. Pete simply rests, maintaining the dignity of the father Yul has always known, while his son remains nearby without feeling the need to fill every silence. Earlier, Yul had searched for words. Now he seems to understand that presence can sometimes say what language cannot. The imagined camera begins to move away from them. First, Pete disappears slowly from the frame. Then Yul, still seated beside his father, becomes smaller beneath the soft light of the room. We move through the doorway and into the corridor where the night has grown almost completely silent. There, on the same chair from the beginning, sits the glass of water. It is still untouched. Nobody remembers exactly who placed it there or how many hours it has been waiting. Perhaps everyone simply became too distracted to notice it. The clock continues forward. 10:18. Then another minute passes. Nothing extraordinary happens, yet somehow every second now feels visible. Behind the door, the light remains on. Yul does not leave. He no longer watches the clock, because for once, he is not measuring how long he has been there. The imagined camera moves farther down the corridor, leaving father and son behind without telling us what tomorrow will bring. The glass remains on the chair, the room remains illuminated, and through the narrowing doorway we can still see Yul sitting quietly beside his father as the edges of the frame slowly disappear into darkness.